So, good afternoon and hello everyone. I would like to continue talking about climate and erosion in the Central Andes, and you remember from last week's lecture that we left off at the linkages between climate and erosion. What I would like to do now is I would like to go back and reiterate some of the key points about the South American monsoon system, and I do that with a few new figures to show you some of the bigger and probably more important concepts of the South American monsoon system. And then we jump straight ahead to the linkages between climate and erosion. So I start out by showing you a global map and by showing you the monsoon areas. So this is a map where I have mapped out the global or monsoon areas in the hatched signature, and I defined the monsoon areas where every single grid cell or grid point where the precipitation rate of the summer minus winter precipitation exceeds 2.5 millimeters per day, and the local summer precipitation exceeds 55% of the annual total. In other words, I've been mapping out the areas that are highly seasonal. In other words, where you have highly seasonal rainfall. And you can see we have the Asian monsoon domain, we have the East African monsoon domain, and we have the South American monsoon domain. And this is where I would like to move in now. And I'm showing you a map here on the left-hand side of topography and the glacial distribution. So you see here the circles. The circles indicate the glacial sizes that occur throughout the Andes. So we have a couple of larger glaciers here. Then we have many glaciers in the Peruvian Andes and a few larger ones here and in the Andes knee. And this is the one that we talked about in the last week's lecture, the Calcaya ice cap, the icon of the South America, or the icon of tropical glaciers. We then have more glaciers further south where the westerlies come in again. In other words, we have glaciers being located south of 30 degrees south, where the moisture transport direction changes and air from the Pacific moves into the Andean origin. We have very few glaciers in the central Andes due to the following reasons. I'm going to show you a couple of slides why this is the case. It's not only moisture, it's also a combination of height and height distribution. I mostly talked about rainfall during the last week's lecture. I would like to show that temperature also varies in space and time. This is a map showing you the maximum monthly temperature measured in Kelvin, and I'm certain you are aware of the fact that 0 degrees Celsius are 273 Kelvin. What I would like to point out is that the high elevations, the elevations above 4 and 5 kilometers, they are fairly cool year round. So there is not that much temperature variability at the high mountain ranges. In fact, if we look at the temperature variability, this is the temperature variability between day and night derived from satellite remote sensing data. We see that the tropical regions of the Amazon and partly the Andes in the tropics are fairly constant, and day and night temperatures only vary by 1 to 2 degrees. So in other words, it has the same temperature in the night and in the day. But if we move down south into northwestern Argentina, this is the region that all of you will be going to in, most of you will be going to in March, we see a much larger temperature variability. This is where the atmosphere becomes unstable, where other circulation systems become more important, and where you have large differences between day and night temperatures. So in those regions, climate is clearly different than further up north from the northern Central Andes. We can look at this from a different perspective, and I am now turning this image around. I'm rotating it by 90 degrees, so we can look at it from from north to south. This is South America rotated by 90 degrees, and we see the blue dots indicate glacial locations. And what I'm showing here in this swath profile, essentially a long strike of the origin of the Andes, we see the maximum elevation. So wherever we exceed elevations of 4 and 5 kilometers, we do have glaciers. So those dots indicate glaciers. So we only get glaciers at the high volcanic peaks in the tropics. So every glacier that you see up in here in Colombia or in Peru or in Ecuador is on a volcano. Then once we move into Peru, here this is the Peruvian Cordillera, we have elevations that exceed, or there are large areas that exceed 4 and 5 kilometers. This is where we have the densest accumulation of glaciers in the Central Andes. Then we have a few spots in the southern Central Andes, and then once we are influenced by the westerlies again, we do have many glaciers, but this is outside the monsoon domain. So this is not something that we worry about. What I would like to point out that these glacial locations is a function of height, in other words temperature, and moisture amount. So this is the same figure, but now showing precipitation, all the precipitation that falls above 500 meters elevation, so all the precipitation that falls in the mountain ranges. We see high precipitation in this region here, where we have steep topography, where we force out a lot of rainfall. This is the orographic rainfall peak again. And this also coincides with the location of the densest glaciers in Peru. Then once we move towards Bolivia and northwestern Argentina, the amount of moisture that gets transported onto or into the origin is much, much lower. So you see the blue line decreases rapidly. And only at the very highest peaks we can have snow cover. In fact, currently there is no active glacier in this region. So there used to be glaciers in the past when we had a different temperature regime, but currently different temperature and precipitation regime, but currently there is no active glaciers. So with this short recap, I would like to move back to the Central Andes. We looked at this before, the swath profile across the Altiplano Puna Plateau, and we looked at the rainfall gradient and the topography. So this is the internally drained part of the Andean Plateau. This is rainfall increasing when the topography is rising steeply. So that's the orographic rainfall peak. We talked about vegetation cover. That vegetation cover is fairly constant outside of the mountain range in the Rio de la Plata basin, and then vegetation peaks at the steep mountain ranges and then drops down when reaching the central Puna. We used an analog of what happens when a big storm migrates into this region. This is an analog showing how vegetation cover changes when a big storm migrates into the Puna. That's when you do have, and you do see additional vegetation cover occurring in places where it is usually fairly barren. But vegetation cover never changes in the central Puna, or I should say, does not change on decadal timescales in the central Puna. This is a fairly dry region where you would need much more moisture to release the nutrients in the soil, whereas you have plenty of nutrients freely available in the eastern Puna, and you just need to bring in a little bit of moisture. This serves an analog to past climate changes. We talked about the lake, or we talked about the Minchin wet phase and the Tauca wet phase. These are two large-scale wet phases that corresponds to lake level high stands in the Puna. This is essentially the Paleo Lake Titicaca. So, 40,000 years ago, you would have called Lake Titicaca Minchin and not Titicaca. And it was a much, much larger area. Roughly speaking, those climate variations or moisture variations coincide with insolation changes. Okay, I would now like to move on and talk about linkages between climate and erosion. And before I do that, I would like to step back and explain a few basic concepts of what geomorphologists and people studying erosion do. So geomorphology, you have heard that word before, is the study of landforms and processes that shape them. So geomorphologists study forces that move or transport mass on the Earth's surface. The mass can be transported through rivers, which we call fluvial processes, wind, aeolian forces, glaciers, permafrost, biological and biophysical processes. And of course, most of the larger scale mass movements are driven by gravitational processes. So geomorphology is a study of how landscape grows and decays. And with the context of this presentation, I'm interested in what are the magnitudes and timescales of transport processes, and how does climate, vegetation, and civilization impact Earth's surface processes, and how do they interact? In other words, we have natural processes that occur, climate, glaciers, big rainstorms that shape the landscape, but we also ourselves, we shape the landscape. And some people argue that our imprint on the Earth's surface is bigger than some of the natural processes, but that's something that needs to be discussed. So it sounds simple, but what the major problem is with geomorphological studies is that as with many other things in earth sciences, is that these processes occur stochastically. In other words, you have maybe 50 days, not a single grain being moved, and then you have a single day or a single hour where you end up transporting a lot of material. So the sediment transport is one of the key processes that we look at. Sediment transport is extremely important because sediment transport provides the nutrients for all of our fertile floodplains. So there would be no beer in Bavaria without the Alps. That's very clear. There would be no wine in the Andean origin without the Andes that transport the nutrients, the fine-grained material that contains nutrients that can be extracted from plants. So this is the benefit of sediment transport. The difficulty with sediment transport and measuring it is that sediment transport is a very or extremely stochastic process. If we look at the discharge or the transport of suspended sediment to the oceans, we clearly see that the Himalayan region is dominating the overall global budget, but similarly, the second largest one are the Andes. And in fact, you would need to add all of these three areas together in order to get the total Andean sediment flux. So there are significant numbers being transported from the Andean origin into the oceans, and that also drives a lot of the processes in the ocean, a lot of nutrient processes, but this is not part of what we are going to talk about. Again, let me point out the key problems here. Sediment transport is a stochastic, event-based process, which means that there are long periods with nothing happening, and then there are single events that occur. The problem is that many time series are not long enough, and they do not capture the extreme events. So that's similarly to when you have a seismometer, which is very useful and makes very precise recordings. But if your time series is not long enough, you're not able to interpolate into the past. There is still a lack of process-based transport models that allow prediction based on boundary conditions. So in that sense, metrology is much further than geomorphology because there exist a lot of transport processes that have been tackled in the past. Always keep in mind when you see sediment transport measurements from gauging stations in rivers, then they tend to be highly unreliable because they only may capture the last 10 years, but we do know from other records that sediment transports or the cycles of sediment transports can exceed several centuries. In other words, usually you don't have an instrumental record which is hundreds of years long, therefore it is very tricky to capture some of the inherent variability. So now you may say, well, why would we care about sediment transport? And I can provide you, among many answers, one answer, and one answer is that nowadays most of the green energy is being derived from large reservoirs, hydropower plants. Hydropower plants have a reservoir that store water but also store sediment, and that's the problem. So if you have an increase in sediment transport, you fill in your reservoir and then there is less volume for water storage. In other words, if you don't account for sediment transport, you shorten the lifetime of your reservoirs. And in fact, this is exactly what happens to the world's largest reservoir dam that has been constructed, I think now 12 years ago, the Three Gorges Dam in China. Their estimation of reservoir filling had to be changed in the last couple of years several times. So from an initially 100-year lifespan, we are now down to 65-year lifespans that somehow needs to be accounted for because the investment of several $1 billion into building this dam, the hydropower plant dam, only pays off if you can run it for 100 years. So sediment flux is important, or understanding sediment flux is important for understanding reservoir filling, for example. So this is one linkage that you can make to our human world. In the field, you can identify sediment transport or abnormal sediment transport by closely observing. So this is an example. You will see that. We will drive along this region. This is the Quebrada del Toro. This is a bridge that has been built, and I can guarantee you that the engineers that built that bridge did not build that bridge with that much sediment being stored in the river. So in other words, there was easily 20 meter more space below that bridge. But because of recent changes in climate, we do increase the amount of sediment transport that then starts to fill in. Another example of this is looking at these, that's the same river, by the way, the Quebrada del Toro, looking at these trees, and I don't think you need to be a biologist to understand that those trees did not grow through these pebbles. This is something that occurred within the past 20 or 15 years. So this region is actively filling in with sediment. Another example of this is the Quebrada de Humahuaca, where we have a train track that was active in the late 80s, and since then has been essentially drowned with sediment because the flux has been increasing recently. So there have been significant infrastructural damage due to sediment flux changes. Where does the sediment come from? Well, one explanation is that the increased sediment may potentially come from recent erosional processes that we call, the process is called rilling, or the features, the geomorphic features are called arroyos, or deeply incised canyons. These are dominant, and you can observe these in every semi-arid landscape. So this is not unique to the Andean origin or to northwestern Argentina. You can observe those throughout the southwestern United States, for example. So with this, I would like to look at some numbers and rates of how fast sediment can be transported. And I'm going to focus on the region of the south central Puna. So you have seen that topographic map several times, and you will see it many more times during the excursion too. At some point, but so it would be good to become familiar with the general topographic and climatic setting there. We are now going to focus on the south central Puna in this location here. So this is a blue marble MODIS image that shows the true colors of this region, and I'm just pointing out that those white regions that you observe here, these are no glaciers or snow covers, these are salars. These are salt pans that show the existence of former lakes that have been evaporated, and the different types of salt have been stored in that region. What I also would like to point out, this is, we talked about this in the last week, this is the internally drained border. In other words, everything within the Puna, every water that falls in the Puna stays in the Puna. So this is the internally drained border of the Puna. If we look into the catchments that exist there, this is not one large catchment in the southern Puna. There are many different individual catchments that have been created mostly due to geodynamic activities. So in other words, you have a very dissected landscape that has many, many different catchment areas. If we go to the north, to the Altiplano, you would not see that. You would have one or two large catchment areas. So the southern Puna has a very different geomorphic characteristic. If we look at the topography in the same image, you can appreciate the large basins that occur in some regions. So again, the Puna is separated into hydrological disconnected catchments with very different sizes. We looked at the climatic regime before. I'm showing you again. There is a steep climate gradient. We have rainfall exceeding 2 meters at the eastern front of the Andean origin. And then when we move westward, our region becomes progressively drier with, in general, less than 0.1 meters per year rainfall in the eastern Puna, and then less than 0.05 meters in the central Puna plateau. And an example of how that looks like in the landscape is given here. We have the moisture-soaked, wet regions in this image, where we have a very dense vegetation cover along the slopes. And then once we cross that first orographic barrier and we are in a valley at an approximately similar elevation, we do have a very different vegetation cover, mostly due to a lower mean annual rainfall in this region. So let's stay in that location here south. This is the part of the Santa Maria Basin or the Cafayate Basin, and I'm going to show you a topographic swath profile across that region. Again, we come from the east and go westwards. We are at elevations of a couple of 100 meters, and we go up to the first divide of around 4 kilometers. We have one intramontane basin. You heard about that a couple of weeks ago. Another orographic barrier, another intramontane basin, one more intramontane basin, and then you hit the border of the Puna Plateau. So this is the region of the earlier swath profile that looks at the far eastern part of the Puna Plateau. So what I'm going to show now are erosion rates. These erosion rates have been measured by a geochemical method of cosmogenic radionuclides, and they provide they integrate the erosion rates over several centuries. In other words, we are not looking at a single stochastic event as explained earlier, and we are looking at an integration of a longer period. So we argue that these rates do represent a more true erosion signal because it is not based on instrumental records. So what do we see here? We see that in wet regions without relief, in other words, wet region, low slopes, we have erosion rates of 0.1 millimeter per year. We move into a very wet region with high slopes, our erosion rate goes up to 0.6 millimeters per year. So in other words, what these rates means that on average, each catchment in this region is removing 0.6 millimeters per year. In other words, you remove a thin veneer of 0.6 millimeters per year throughout the catchment. That doesn't mean that every single point in the catchment is eroding equally. In other words, it's not like moving a carpet away from the landscape. It means that on average, your landscape is removing 0.6 millimeters per year. So, you may have locations where you have higher erosion rates, but you average it out to 0.6. Then we move from this very steep wet region, we move to a steep dry region. The same mountain range, we only move 50 kilometers away, and we have an erosion rate of 0.06 millimeters per year, so a factor of 10 lower. Then erosion rates increase again when we have a slight increase in rainfall rates. And then erosion rates decrease and remain fairly low until we hit the Altiplano Puna Plateau. We have a very steep rainfall gradient that is somewhat mimicked by a precipitation gradient. By a erosion rate gradient. So I would like to draw your attention a little more to this steep gradient where we have the same mountain range with the same lithology. On the wet hand side, 0.6 millimeters per year of erosion rate, and then we just move across that drainage divide into the dry part of the landscape, and we decrease erosion rates by a factor of 10. And this is something that is driven mostly by the current climatic situation. But then, if you're a structural geologist and you think about the implications of this, this would mean that when you erode this part 10 times as fast as this side of the mountain range, you would end up creating an oblique origin, right? Because you remove more from one side than from the other side. That is true, but we know that this rate that we measure here has changed, for example, in the Minchin wet period. So if we go 40,000 years into the past, we increase this rate, which is currently 0.06 millimeters per year, we increase this to 0.6 millimeters per year. In other words, that imbalance between the eastern and the western side of this range, if we integrate through longer periods of time, will level out. So this is one of the indicators that erosion rates change through time, and they can change by a factor of 10 easily through time. So that's something that is also important if you look at larger scale sediment budgets and the amount of sediment that is being transported into the ocean. So these fluxes are not constant in time. They can in fact vary a lot on timescales of several thousands to 10,000s of years. But what I'm showing here, that steep rainfall gradient resulting in an erosion rate gradient, that can also be expressed as something that mimics or can be expressed as the product of rainfall times steepness. And we briefly touched upon this in the last week's lecture. We can generate an index which we refer to as a specific stream power, and the specific stream power tells us what is the erosion potential of a stream. And it is taking the steepness, the channel slope into account. So the steeper it is, the more, the higher the ability to move material, the higher your specific stream power, but also the discharge. And the more water you have, the higher your transport capacity. So essentially, discharge times channel slope tells you what your transport capacity is, and we use the specific stream power, and specific stream power means dividing the stream power by the channel width. So we are essentially normalizing it by a length factor, and the channel width is measuring how wide your channel is, and the idea behind that is if you have water flowing through a narrow, deep gorge, a very narrow gorge, you force the same amount of water through a smaller area, and therefore your water is flowing faster, and therefore you increase the erosion rate. So channel width is another modulator that tells you, or that allows you to distinguish between regions where the river is wider and is allowed to spread out versus regions where you have a gorge-like feature. So what I'm showing here is two models of the specific stream power. This is a standard model where we say that discharge scales with drainage areas, because we rarely have continuous rainfall measurements in mountain ranges. We just say, well, on average, our drainage area scales with discharge, which means the larger the drainage area, the larger the discharge. Makes sense, right? The larger your area is that you collect rainfall in, the larger your discharge gets. The only problem with this is that if you have a steep rainfall gradient, in other words, if your rainfall is not evenly distributed throughout the landscape, then that scaling doesn't work well. So it's particular in the Andes and in the Himalayas, the scaling with the drainage area is not working well. But we can use our trim data, the rainfall data, and look at the actual discharge. And this is the same calculation as here, except that we use actual discharge, and this is using the drainage area. And what I would like to point out that by using our rainfall data as a discharge input, we see, this is by the way the step from the moisture-soaked front to the dry parts. So this is where we have the tenfold difference in erosion rate. We see that we go from high specific stream power to low specific stream power. Whereas if we use the drainage area, we go from high to high specific stream power, but that would not allow us to explain the erosion rates. So what geomorphologists like to do is they like to take the erosion rate measurements from each of those catchments that can be collected in the field and compare it to some index. Here I'm using the specific stream power. You generally call these indices the topometric indices, and you will hear more about this from Taylor Shilton next week. But there are additional indices that you can use. Specific stream power is one, steepness index is another one, their relief is another one, and geomorphologists look for the relation between those topometric indices and the erosion rate measurements from the field. So this is an example how those plots have been generated for different origins. This is an example here for the northwestern Argentine Andes. This is our model, our mean catchment specific stream power, what I just have shown. This is our spatial distribution of erosive power. And these are our actual measurements. So these are our CRN, or our cosmogenic radionuclide erosion rates. And while this is certainly not the best relation that you have seen, it is a fairly robust relation that develops over a certain range. So in other words, what this allows us to do, it allows us to predict erosion rates, because each of those points that we show here has taken several weeks to months in the lab and has cost several $100s. We cannot sample every single catchment in the landscape. So we look for a way to substitute these measurements, or to substitute areas where we don't have measurements for with a model. And this model that I'm showing here is one way to explain how the landscape will evolve. In other words, we can use a specific stream power or also the steepness index to describe erosion in the landscape. So this is the idea behind it, and you will see that many times if you start looking into the geomorphology literature of the past decade. What I would like to point out here is that it is important to take the actual discharge data. If we would do the same exercise with a drainage area approach, we end up getting a much weaker relationship. So this is, by the way, now showing the steepness index as an additional parameter. This is using actual discharge in blue. The red line indicates the drainage area, and there is a significant difference in the Pearson's correlation coefficient. Okay, let's think about this for a second, and I'm now going to address the question, well, if the landscape is so sensitive to climate, are there other signatures in the landscape that we can look at that will tell us that the climate looks different? And I'm going to do that by looking at classic geology plots or geomorphology plots that show the so-called log area, log channel slope plot. So you can envision, so now focus on me. Now envision you're standing up on a mountain range on a ridge crest and you start to walk down. You start to walk down a channel. You are increasing the drainage area, right? With every step you do, you go downstream and you increase the drainage area, the area that is upstream of you, right? So you increase that while you go down. But also, the slope that the river channel that you're walking down becomes less and less and less steep. You know, if you're in a really large mountain range, you have to walk for a long time, maybe 5 or 10 kilometers before the slope gets less. But generally speaking, if you increase your drainage area, if you go downstream, the rivers become less steep. You know, think about the Alps. The rivers that originate at the mountain peaks are fairly steep in the beginning, and as soon as they go into the foreland regions or into Bavaria, you end up getting shallower and shallower slopes. So what you see here is a representation of this, where we have looked at many channels that come out of this region. And I'm now only showing the profiles or the channel slopes for regions from the arid region. So in other words, all the red areas here in the landscape. And what we see is there is a certain relation. This is another power law that can be developed and that has been well described since 30 or 40 years. And it essentially tells you the relation between channel slope and drainage area. If you start walking downstream, your channel slope becomes less and less and less. So it's a negative power law relation for the arid regions. If we do the same exercise for the humid regions, in other words, for regions where you have more water in the landscape, your channel slopes are less steep for the same given drainage area. So let's say we have a drainage area of 10 to the 7 square meters, which is 10 square kilometers, so it's a reasonable sized catchment. If we look at the very wet region, we have a channel slope that is less than the channel slope for the arid regions. So why would that be? Well, because we have a higher discharge, we can transport more material for a given slope. So remember that transport depends on discharge times channel slopes. If we have less water, we need steeper slopes to transport the same amount of sediment. If we have more water, we need less steep slopes. And that relation is very well documented by comparing the dry and the humid areas. So what you now could say is, okay, if that is true, then why don't we plot discharge down here? So if we end up relating everything to discharge, then we would collapse, or then we will collapse the two different regions into one data set. And this is exactly what we did if we end up taking the real discharge measurements, all of the different regions that stretch out over several hundreds of kilometers collapse. And let me just point out that even so I only show a few dots here, each of those dots or each of the relation depends on several 10,000s or 100,000s of measurements. So the single dots that I've been showing is essentially an accumulation of several hundreds to thousands of measurements. So it's a fairly robust result that we end up getting here. So bottom line of this story is if you have landscapes that have a lot of water, you tend to have lower slopes because you just need less gravitational driving forces because your water is transporting a lot of material. If you have a very arid region where you have less water available, you need steeper slopes to transport the same amount of material. So I would like to put the erosion rates that we have talked about in the past 30 minutes or so into a geographical perspective. This is again our study region, and generally what you observe is that going from the wet regions towards the dry regions, we do see a decrease in erosion rates. So the wet regions have erosion rates that are high. The dry regions have erosion rates that are lower. I remind you that geomorphologists also look at aeolian erosion rates. As pointed out before, these are mostly the fluvial erosion rates, so erosion rates that occur through the force of water. But we are also looking at aeolian erosion rates, so the wind-driven erosion rates. This is an example of what wind erosion looks like. You have particular features that form, for example, on granitic or other lithologies through the abrasion of the wind. In other words, you can imagine the wind, increased wind speeds allows to pick up grains, and those little sand grains, they end up shaping and smoothing parts of the landscape. So you can go to these features, take samples, and we then can measure the erosion rate of those features. And what we have measured in this region is the erosion rates or wind-driven erosion rates increase from the Puna margin. There the erosion rates are fairly low. And the wind-driven erosion rates in the central Puna are higher than the fluvial erosion rates. So the central Puna is one of these locations similar to the Tarim Basin and other very arid regions where there is more material transported through wind than through water. That has been described for other desert regions or high elevation regions as well. So that's something to keep in mind, that at a certain point when your fluvial erosion or your river-driven erosion rates are fairly low, your wind erosion may end up picking up. So in other words, big dust storms that occur in this region are an important part of the erosional agent. So this is very important to keep in mind. It's not only done, the work or the geomorphic work is not only done through water. So let me wrap it up here by pointing out that the catchment mean erosion rates decrease by 2 orders of magnitude across the south central Andes from east to west. In other words, we go from roughly 2 millimeters per year to 0.02 millimeters per year in the central Puna. In contrast, the wind erosion increases from east to west by 1 order of magnitude. So we have wind erosion rates that are much less than 1 micrometer per year to 20 micrometers and more in the central Puna. We talked a long time about the climatic patterns, and I hope that I made the point clear that climatic patterns exert a first-order control on erosion rates along the steep climatic gradient. So that when we go from the wet regions to the dry regions, a lot of the variability in erosion rate is driven by the climatic variability. But at the same time, keep in mind that climate is not constant through time. Climate is changing. And with the changing climate, we also change the erosion rates. So we know that when we increase precipitation during the pluvial periods, I mentioned the example of the Minchin and the Tauca phases, we also increase erosion rates in those locations. It is just a little more difficult to measure paleo-erosion rates, past erosion rates, because you have less remnants available in the landscape that allow you to measure these. Thank you.